I can do this by memory, was Brandon Adler as captain, and he was the inject lead. I was co-captain. I was on the domain controller. We had Simon. He was our networking guy on the Palo Alto. We had Connor, who was on Windows clients / just general Windows stuff. We had Jack, who was our Linux lead, and you just did Linux stuff? I don't really know.
Yeah, just Linux stuff.
That's the best I got. Okay. All right. Now from memory, we had Duck also on Linux, helping Jack with Linux stuff. We had Amanda doing Windows clients, and she helped a lot out with Injects, which was super awesome. Amanda Brown. Who else? Newman, who was also doing Windows and mainly dealing with the Hyper-V service. And who else? Am I missing anyone? That's everyone, right?
That's Philip. Philip was an alternate.
Oh, okay, yeah, alternate. So we had Philip, who was an alternate, who has a blue grill in the front, and so Philip was an alternate, and they were a huge help overnight. We also had Robert as an alternate, and
Shout out to Robert. Not here right
yeah, Nick was also super helpful throughout the weekend as well. Yeah, Nick and Joe, our assistant coach, all super helpful throughout the weekend, helping us keep us calm and giving us good advice. And Bo was also our coach, who was super helpful. Drove us down and bought all our meals and fed us, kept us happy. So
Yeah, it was nice.
yeah, so shout out to everyone on the team. They were all super helpful. But anyways, on to Windows and Active Directory. Mike, I have to do that. I'm just gonna, because I'll forget. Okay. Anyways, so Active Directory, I was on the domain controller. And so this year, we actually had kind of like a best practice sort of setup where the domain controller was actually a Windows Server core, which is a big yikes in my opinion for CCDC because you don't have a GUI. And a lot of the Active Directory things you have to do require a GUI or just like really hard without one. So I definitely had to step up my PowerShell game quite a bit for like my initial plan. And but we still treated it like it was best practice, right? Like, we still, eventually, once we got everything kind of set up, like firewall rules, we create backup users, change passwords, stuff like that. I eventually moved to the management box to administer like the Active Directory environment because it's just really too hard. Like doing GPOs and managing users and stuff is kind of difficult through PowerShell. It's just a lot slower and it feels a lot more like tedious. So that's what we kind of did for our plan. Overall, it worked pretty well. We implemented some like whitelisting for DNS that worked really well and stopped all like red team's DNS beacons. But they, their initial persistence in the box was pretty heavy. They had plenty of like fake accounts with domain admin privileges that we had to go through, and they had some fake services as well that probably were using Cobalt Strike to call back. So, but again, the DNS whitelisting helped a lot, and we also had a squid proxy, which I'm sure Jack will talk about a little bit, but that was HTTP proxy that helped us too. So that way HTTP beacons couldn't get out, so that was super good. I would think of another slide. Yeah, so on the inject side of things for Windows, they really hammered home PKI, which was super cool because I had never done PKI before, so I learned a lot about that really quickly, but also super not cool because there was a lot of PKI. So. And this became like a big challenge as well because in the middle of a competition, they, on the second day, they actually decided to take one of our boxes from us, which was the management host that Connor started off on. So, yeah, and he'll talk about that in a sec. But that became a big problem because there was less hands on the keyboard at that point because we had one less computer, and that meant it was harder for us to actually administer, PKI, do the injects, and administer the network or the domain. So we actually migrated to Hyper-V and put another domain controller up on Hyper-V to actually administer it from there. So, but we actually did that before they took the box, which is super lucky. So we had like no downtime with the management box, which was awesome. So that was a really great big plus for us. It helped us out a lot. Yeah, but overall, the PKI injects were probably like the biggest challenge throughout the whole competition for me because I was just like, I didn't know what CERT, what was it, CRL, CLR? CRL, yeah, CERT revocation list. I didn't know what that was, and then they're like, yeah, develop a CRL. I was like, hey, Brandon, what's a CRL? So, that was, but it was really great for me to kind of get that experience and kind of, be able to think on my feet like that. So, yeah. that was super cool. I really enjoyed it, and it was a good challenge, but I feel like Windows, we did really well overall. So, and Connor will talk about the management side of things on his box.
Is this going to... Hello. Is this working?
Yes.
Cool.
So that goes to the stream, that goes to everybody else.
So I need to do both? I'm trying. I'm
Just
trying.
stand
I'm
here
trying.
and just talk.
Talk.
Hey there. We're gonna do one of these. There you go.
Thanks. I haven't given a presentation here yet before.
Oh,
he's got to get a lanyard.
Heck yeah. Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you. So I was on the management box. This was initially on the wireless, and that was a big pain because it was our IIS server initially. Who puts a web server on the wireless? What we did with management is kind of installed some remote system administration tools so that we would be able to connect to our Active Directory domain and administer it through NMC or through some built-in like group policy. You can just kind of connect to your domain controller through that. One of the first things that we did with management after moving it off of the wireless was we promoted it to a domain controller, and we set up like replication between DC1 and management, which then kind of became DC2. That was done as an inject, but it was kind of our plan going in to have multiple DCs anyway, because they were really pushing for redundancy and resilience and disaster recovery. And what's more disastrous than losing your domain controller? And that's actually exactly what happened. After we set up DC2 on management, we spun up another DC on the Hyper-V box. And yeah, so we had three domain controllers. They came in, they took my management box at, was that day 1 or day 2?
That was day 2.
Day 2. A little bit into day 2, they came in, they took my laptop, and I didn't really have a laptop. I was a floater. I jumped between other Windows boxes and actually some Linux boxes for a little bit, trying to do research and write injects, because injects, I think
we covered it,
yeah, one of the, or multiple injects were kind of research paper style things. And it's hard to do research on something that you don't know if you don't have internet or a browser. I can't just wget pages if I don't know what they are. So with management, they only score the default website. Like you start up IIS and they probably like greped for IIS server manager or something. So that meant we were able to migrate IIS to Hyper-V. And at one point in time, I got management back. They brought back a new laptop. It was Windows 10. We wiped it. We installed Server 2016. And I spent like 20 minutes hardening that. And then they took that box too. Yeah.
Yeah. Real quick, I forgot to talk about this, but yeah, they came in and when they took management again, first they came in. I don't know if you're here, but I think you're working on something. But they, yeah, the guy came in and was like, hey, we need we need a box. We need to take a box, and we were like, you already took our management. And he's like, okay, give me your other your main domain controller, like DC1. I was like. I froze, and I'm like, oh no, like if they take our domain controller, we're screwed, right? And then thankfully the black team member was like, no, like don't do that to them. So then we just gave them back the old management box, which is, thankfully that like saved us, because if they would have taken our like main domain controller, that would have been a big that would completely been a disaster. That would have been an actual disaster.
Would not have been a fun time. Yeah, so after we got management taken for the second time, which was hardened DC. They brought it back, thankfully. This was very kind of them. Really appreciate this. They brought back an XP box. When you opened it up and started it, it auto-logged in. There was redteam.exe running. The mouse was like 500 times the size. It was a mess. So we just turned that box off, pushed it off to the side, and we were like, okay, whenever we get a free 30 minutes with our flash drive, we'll re-image the box. And we never got a free 30 minutes with the flash drive, so I didn't have a laptop for the last few hours. So that was cool. For IIS on management, the site kept getting defaced. I tried to figure out what was going wrong with it. I set up Procmon. I set up some filtering that only filtered on the website like the HTML file, because the HTML file would be overwritten with like red team defaced this site kind of thing. But we couldn't actually find what was changing the website, even though I was checking file or create file, modify file, like open file, all the different file operations that you can do in Procmon. Couldn't find it. Turns out it was like a driver. And I have no clue how they did that without anything registering in Procmon, so that kind of sucked. And we just migrated IIS, actually. Since it was the default site, we could just spin it up on Hyper-V. Speaking of Hyper-V.
Yeah, I can talk about Hyper-V since Newman is not here with us today.
So basically, the Hyper-V box, if any of you have dealt with hypervisors like ESXi or even VMware Workstation, it's kind of like that, right? Except it's Microsoft. So what does it run on? Windows Server. Who wants a hypervisor to run on Windows Server? Nobody. So thankfully, this actually had a GUI, which in production they shouldn't. So realistic, question mark. Managing it with PowerShell is honestly pretty easy. You can do some things in PowerShell that you can't do in the web GUI. And likewise, you can do some things in the web GUI that you can't do in PowerShell. So that's always fun. So you gotta kind of have both. Like to console into a VM, you actually need a computer on the domain to connect to Hyper-V to get the console. You can't do it from PowerShell. You can't do it from a client not on the domain. You can't do it from a Linux box. So that kind of sucks. So that we had like 3 boxes we could use at one point to log on to Hyper-V, but then when they took one, we could really only do it from Hyper-V. And yeah, exactly. So providing the VM consoles to actually set up VMs and configure them first off was kind of annoying because we didn't totally want to open SSH to the red team in case they had something on Hyper-V or had something on the VM that was already on the box. So several people at one point needed to get on the VMs on Hyper-V, and we basically had a queue set up of people waiting for who needs to access their VM next. So that was kind of a problem during the competition. Thankfully, it was only scored on ping, and it wasn't originally connected to the domain. So we only, in the firewall, we only allowed ping in and out. And then when Newman had to go out and get an ISO or something from the internet, he had to set firewall rules up for his browser to get out of the firewall, which you can do in Windows. Awesome. Highly recommend for blue teams. Whitelisting applications instead of just allowing every application out to port 80. Lifesaver. And so that's basically all we had coming in and out on this box for most of the competition was ping. Because from a red team perspective, if you were able to get on a blue team's hypervisor, you're golden. Because once you're on, you can turn off VMs. You can theoretically modify VMs, and you can take down the whole hypervisor, which could be up to 7 scored services. So that would have hit us pretty hard if they took that down. So I already talked about ping. As we were previously saying, due to our firewall rules, the red team activity was pretty limited. At one point, our box actually restarted because when Newman had his firewall rules more open, since he was connecting to the internet, it just happened that one of the red team implants on the box called out to the CobbleStrike server, and it got a command to restart our Hyper-V box. So when it first restarted, it kind of looked like it was updating. The blue rectangle came up and said, "We're installing updates. We're going to shut down in a minute." And he was like, "This isn't good." And then when it restarted, it just went black, like he shut off the power button, but he didn't actually do that. So he knew something was pretty weird from that, and later we verified that that actually was red team activity. So thankfully they didn't do too much and just restarted our box. Yeah, and so red team actually had another thing that they were kind of using to troll all the teams. So if anybody of you know, they had a GIF of a dancing banana, peanut butter and jelly time, the dancing banana from Peanut Butter Jelly Time. They had 10 of these that popped up on your screen, and they just danced while you were trying to do stuff. So it hit a couple other teams, and they showed it in the red team debrief video. And honestly, it was pretty funny. Lucky it didn't hit us though, because that would have been super annoying. Splunk. You want to talk about Splunk? Awesome.
So one of the things we totally missed when we were preparing is that Tom Kochak is on the red team for NECCDC, and he works at Splunk. And actually last year at B-Sides, he did a Splunk like workshop that some of us had gone to. Anyways, we didn't realize he was on the red team, and so when we were preparing to do logging, we were assuming we were going to build our own logging infrastructure, so we spent a lot of time practicing with Graylog. Minute 0, we get to Hyper-V, turn it on, there's a Splunk VM, and Newman and I started crying. Splunk is great. We just hadn't printed out the materials to set up our Splunk infrastructure, which is what we did last year. Day 2, we came in with like printed how to Splunk, but day 1, we were a little like, we should have thought about that. That was oversight. Anyways, we got there. It was already installed. They pwned it pretty quickly. Our first inject was to set up logging on Splunk, and we had prepared and gotten really good at setting up logging for Graylog, but I think they gave us like 30 minutes, and they're like, all right, everything in your infrastructure, log to Splunk. Did not happen, not even a little bit. I think we logged into Splunk at the end of 30 minutes. So that was rough. It also took us by surprise that that was the first inject, because historically it's always been a inventory inject where you fill out a bunch of papers and say like, this is the boxes we have on our network, but there wasn't any inject like that. So there was a couple surprises, which was good. Yeah, so they stopped our scoring by changing the UI to say managed by red team and then stole our passwords. Docker, this is what Duck Fan worked on. He's not here right now, so I'll talk about it. But our CentOS box was originally going to be a virtualized box, and then before the competition, they moved it to a real box, which was great, because we didn't have to run BSD on bare metal, and that was the best thing that ever happened. Thank God. So yeah, only ping was scored. It took Duck about 2 hours to figure out how to log in. We got to talk to one of the red teamers afterwards, and he had dropped a PAM backdoor. And what he didn't realize until after he deployed is that the PAM backdoor broke a lot of things when you tried to log in because of SE Linux. And so when you tried to log in, his PAM backdoor tried to do something that SE Linux was blocking, and so all login just failed. And so Duck spent like 2 hours in single user mode trying to figure it out, and eventually he's just like, all right, we're getting rid of SE Linux, and that fixed it. He logs in, he's like, well, 2 hours behind now, and red team's popped everything. Better bring up scoring. Luckily, it was only pinged on ICMP, and after that, well, that box was pretty bodied the entire time, actually. Red team was pretty much in, and they owned it by after the first 2 hours, so we ended up migrating everything off of it and calling that one a day. Okay. Yeah, so part of that, we also set up our own proxy and DNS server in the cloud. They were clean VMs, so the only way to get to them would have been if they had already infected the Hyper-V server and were somehow injecting into the boxes. And this was just to prevent callbacks. Some of the more advanced callbacks, like DNS callbacks, Simon just applied a block all rule so that the only thing out for DNS and HTTP was this server. Yeah, so we had one BSD box. It was virtualized when we got there, which was fucking awesome. PF is awesome, according to Duck. Yeah, he's a big fan. But anyways, we got an inject for it. We had to install a Git T server, which is a Git subversions system. It specifically said to do it on the BSD box, which kind of sucked, because normally we would just install it on something else and make it super easy, but oh well. Yeah. Canvas. So this is the box I spent all of my time on. Hour 1, our database got dropped, so that was either my fault or red team. I'm pretty sure it wasn't my fault, but like, if it was red team, that was really rude because that was hour 1 and our service just went down. Anyways, luckily in the 5-minute plan, we made a backup of it. We had 3 databases with the content of Canvas running at one time. We had one in Docker, one in the CentOS VM on bare metal, and then one in a VM on the hypervisor. And so we had a lot of redundancy in terms of the database. So that check didn't ever go down. The only problem was the actual Canvas box takes about 30 minutes to migrate, ideally. However, in the process of migrating, I had very limited internet, and then my tar backup was corrupted, so I wasn't able to pull out the compiled assets, which meant that I had to recompile everything, which usually takes about an hour and a half to do from start to finish. So we had 2 half-working Canvas boxes, 3 databases, and very little scoring on that box. Here's your little Mikey.
Thanks, buddy. Yeah, I'm sorry about Canvas. Yeah, it's okay. All right, so I was in charge of our networking and everything. So I actually got to play with a Palo Alto 3050, which is kind of cool because it's a multi-$1,000 piece of hardware. So I'll probably never see one again except at Nationals. So that was pretty cool. Also, the cool thing about physical Palo Altos is those things are like fortresses. So like the only way that I'm aware to actually access the management of them and actually, do things to the configuration on a physical one at least is to plug in a console cable into the console port and then, use PuTTY or SSH or whatever, or plug an Ethernet cable into a management port, and that allows you to access the web GUI. So thankfully, Red Team, couldn't hit those unless they walked into our room and plug in, which I'm pretty sure they wanted to at one point. And we also had the Wi-Fi isn't on here. But yeah, one management port. Everything was hooked up to a switch and then to our router. But unfortunately, our switch was out of scope. But Red Team did do some nasty things to our switch, which was not nice. We also had a tiny little access point. I almost didn't even see it whenever we were in the room. And it was running OpenWRT, which is like an open source, just like a router application firmware image that you can use. And fun fact, Red Team one of the Red Team members, Silas Cutler, actually wrote a custom firmware image to backdoor our wireless router for all the teams. But for some reason, we didn't have it, because later on in the day, my CEO, the Orange Team CEO, came in with him as an FBI agent. And they're like, your access point has been backdoored. We need to check it, blah, blah, blah. So he checked it, and it was clean. It was fine. But I have no idea how that got cleaned. Probably I reset it 6 to 7 times in the beginning because, I don't know, I kept typing in wrong numbers or wrong passwords or something. So must have updated the firmware somewhere in there. I have no idea. But at one point I did see a Red Team member log into our Wi-Fi, and we saw them sitting out in the hallway. He was making his way around to all the rooms. So that was pretty cute. He couldn't do anything though. So here's some tips for you blue teamers at any competitions that you might go to. Bottlenecks. All right, so your network layer and your firewall and everything, that's going to be one of the most important places, and the place where you can really lock Red Team down and not allow them to go, because if they can't get their traffic out, they can't do anything to you. And if they can't pivot, they can't do anything to you, right? So one of the ways we did that, and it's been mentioned already, is we had DNS forwarding. So we spun up a bind server, and then we pointed all of our boxes DNS to that box, to that forwarder, and then that forwarder would then forward our requests out. Okay, so that means if they had any DNS callbacks that were trying to just go straight out to like quad 8s or quad 1s or whatever their custom ones were, they just wouldn't work because their applications and malware weren't set up to go to our forwarder. And the same thing with our Squid proxy. Squid is actually the name of the application that you can download, so you can do like yum install Squid, I'm pretty sure is all it is. And that's basically the same thing, but it's for your HTTP traffic. So you'll send your HTTP request to the Squid proxy, and then the Squid proxy will, proxy them away to wherever you wanted your request to go. And this does the same thing as the DNS forwarder, and it makes it really easy to log all the requests and see where all the traffic's going, because you won't be able to see any pivoting on the LAN segments from the router. So I could see all the traffic trying to go out and trying to come in, but I couldn't see anything going on our internals. So that was up to the clients to log. So this really helped with that. And also, this took like 5 minutes to set up. So before your competition, take like 30 minutes to read up on both of these things, like write down on a piece of paper how to do it, and then come in. As long as you have internet to download the packages, which might not happen, you can get everything configured, typed out in like 5 minutes. It's really, really easy. Well, that's about all we got. Does anybody have any questions? You guys have anything else? No? Yeah, what's up?
Why do you think you did so well this year?
Oh,
I think they did so well. So it definitely helps. So I know last year we had some issues with more or less custom scoring checks that White Team did. So this is for our AWS infrastructure. So basically, if anybody of you know like AWS and know what tags are in AWS, they had a tag set up on our EC2 instance that they had a script that queried the tags to set its IP in Route 53. And we destroyed our EC2 instance, so the tag wasn't there, so the script broke. And then when we spun another one up, we were like, why isn't this scoring? It's because they were doing custom scoring checks. This year, there was some scoring problems, but they were pretty much resolved an hour into the competition. So it wasn't like too big of a deal, but it definitely helps to have a white team and black team that knows what they're doing and knows exactly how to fix things if they break, if they're doing custom checks anyways.
I have something to add if you're done.
Okay.
Also, like I just mentioned, I think a big part of our success was those bottlenecks that we had. Because one thing I did forget to mention is by the end of the day, Jack said that I had put the block all DNS requests and I had a default block all rule on our Palo Alto. By the end of the day, the block DNS request that I had alone was over 200,000. Okay, so that kind of gives you an idea of how much these guys were beaconing. Now, some of that traffic was probably ours because people did forget to change their forwarding address. But that just goes to show you, if you have good firewall rules and you bottleneck your stuff and everybody communicates and you guys just all work together, like you can really lock Red Team out.
And one of the coolest things about locking down the network strategy as well is that we don't care if there's malware on our systems. We don't care if there's beacons trying to get out to their C2s that are still calling out from our systems. As long as they can't get through our firewall or don't have a time bomb set to say after 30 minutes of not being able to reach out, I'm going to execute this command, then they literally can't execute commands on our system and they really don't have access to our systems at all. So try to think about it in that mentality too, not just like clean my system, but how can we prevent the beacons from pivoting and from getting out of our network entirely.
I think also a big thing that we did to really help us, which I talked about briefly, was like migrating. Like the one box Connor talked about had like literally a driver on it, and that would have taken us like ages to find, just because it's signed, and drivers are really hard to pick out from what's legit, what's not, because you can just name it something like Microsoft, blah blah blah, and it's like, oh, this is cool. So yeah, I think like being able to migrate and like have that redundancy throughout our network was like super awesome and like kept our services up. And when they took the management box, we saw like other teams' services went down because they didn't have their IS server anymore. They weren't prepared for it. But like we already had one set up, ready to go, so like it was not a big deal at all. So that was huge. Yeah. Cool. All right. Well, thank you guys very much. Appreciate you guys listening.